The low thrum of the particle accelerator was a constant companion to Reid, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the very floor of the research station. He found a peculiar comfort in its unwavering rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaotic data streams that danced across his monitors. His days unfolded in a precise ballet of observation and analysis, each movement calculated, each result meticulously logged. The air, recycled and filtered, carried the faint, metallic tang of ozone and the sterile scent of cleaning agents, a smell he barely registered anymore. He was hunched over a bank of screens, his fingers flying across a customized keyboard, tracking minute fluctuations in energy signatures, searching for anomalies in the predictable patterns of accelerated particles. His world was one of elegant equations in controlled environments, a universe neatly contained within the reinforced concrete walls of the facility. A sharp rap on the tempered glass of his lab door shattered the quiet order. Reid looked up, blinking against the sudden intrusion. A colleague, usually silent and methodical, stood there, a strange, hesitant expression on their face. The colleague held a thick, cream-colored envelope, its edges crisp and official. "For you," the colleague murmured, sliding it through the small pass-through slot. "A courier just dropped it off. Said it was urgent." Reid took the envelope. It felt heavy, substantial, unlike the usual interdepartment memos or technical journals. His name was printed in an ornate, old-fashioned script, entirely out of place in his modern, streamlined workspace. The return address was a law firm he didn't recognize, located in a remote, unfamiliar city. A prickle of unease, sharp and unexpected, traced its way up his spine. He tore open the seal, the sound surprisingly loud in the hushed room. The letter was brief, formal, and utterly bewildering. It spoke of the sudden passing of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Ilara, whom Reid barely remembered from a faded childhood photograph. The circumstances of her death were vaguely described as unfortunate and unforeseen. More jarring was the revelation that Ilara had named him, her only living kin, as the sole inheritor of her estate. The estate, the letter detailed, consisted primarily of a property, an ancient cabin, deep within a forgotten forest, nestled in a region so remote it barely registered on modern maps. Reid reread the words, secluded, ancient cabin. The phrase felt like a stone dropped into the placid pond of his life. He had no memory of this relative, no connection to any such place. His world was data and logic, not crumbling estates in forgotten woods. Yet, a peculiar sense of obligation, coupled with a burgeoning curiosity, began to tug at him. The letter urged his immediate presence to settle the affairs, hinting at complexities that couldn't be handled remotely. 2 days later, Reid traded the hum of the particle accelerator for the growl of his SUV's engine. He packed light, just a backpack of essentials and a satellite phone, knowing the signal would likely vanish long before he reached his destination. The drive was long, an odyssey away from paved roads and into increasingly dense wilderness. The highway dwindled to a state route, then to a county road, and finally, to a barely there gravel track swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles, a scent that felt primal and ancient. Sunlight, once bright and clear, became a dappled, shifting mosaic through the canopy of towering trees. He drove for hours, the world outside his windows transforming into a seamless wall of green and shadow. The GPS signal flickered and died, leaving him to navigate by the sparse, hand-drawn map provided by the law firm. Each mile deepened the sense of isolation, stripping away the familiar layers of civilization. The silence, once a welcome reprieve from the urban drone, now pressed in, vast and expectant. It wasn't merely the absence of sound, it was a profound, almost living quiet, as if the forest itself held its breath. Reid found himself glancing into the impenetrable depths of the woods, a persistent, irrational feeling that he was being watched. Finally, as the last vestiges of twilight bled across the sky, the gravel track opened into a small, overgrown clearing. And there it was. The cabin wasn't merely old, it was a relic, a silhouette against the fading light. The roof, thick with moss and lichen, seemed to melt into the surrounding forest, as if the earth itself had sprouted a structure. A narrow, rotting porch listed precariously. No smoke rose from the stone chimney, no light flickered within. It stood in profound stillness, a silent sentinel in the heart of the forgotten woods. Reid cut the engine. The sudden cessation of noise was jarring, leaving only the chirping of unseen insects and the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze. The cabin didn't invite him in, it merely stood, waiting. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was here now. And he was utterly alone. Reid tore at the heavy paper, the crisp sound startling in the hushed quiet of his cubicle within the vast, echoing space of the research station. He'd barely registered the low hum of the servers and the distant clatter of a colleague's keyboard before the envelope's contents commanded his full attention. The letter, penned in the same anachronistic script as his name on the front, informed him, with stark formality, of the death of a distant relative he hadn't known existed. An uncle, twice removed, named Silas Thorne. The letter detailed the inheritance, a secluded cabin, its acreage deep within an unnamed forest, and a small, almost insulting sum of money. A legal assistance number was appended, along with an address so remote it barely registered on the common mapping applications. He stared at the coordinates for a long moment, the fluorescent lights of the research station glinting off the stark white page. A cabin. He had no need for a cabin. His life was here, calibrated and precise, surrounded by the cool logic of data and the predictable rhythm of his work. Yet, a peculiar pull, a faint, insistent tug, resonated deep within him. It wasn't greed, nor curiosity, not really. It felt more like an obligation, a loose thread suddenly tightened. The deceased relative had been a recluse, the letter stated, living off the grid. Perhaps it was a final, strange act of a lonely man reaching out. Or perhaps, Reid thought, a way to divest himself of something undesirable. The drive took 2 days, pushing his compact sedan past dwindling towns and into winding, unpaved logging roads that seemed to shrink the sky itself. The forest grew denser with every mile, the trees pressing in, their ancient branches forming a thick, green canopy that swallowed the daylight. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp scent of pine needles and rich, dark earth. His GPS signal flickered, then died, leaving him to navigate by the rough, hand-drawn map the legal assistant had provided, a document that felt more like a treasure map than a practical guide. When he finally saw it, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight, the cabin was more imposing than he'd imagined. It stood on a slight rise, overlooking a small, stagnant pond choked with lily pads, and beyond that, an unbroken wall of trees. He killed the engine, and the sudden cessation of noise was almost painful. Reid fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom, revealing a space cluttered with antique furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts awaiting resurrection. He moved through the cabin slowly, his footsteps echoing on the bare wooden floors. 3 rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, a small kitchen with a hand pump for water, and a stone fireplace that dominated the living area. No electricity. No running water. Just the cabin and the pervasive quiet. The next few days were a blur of unpacking his meager supplies, sweeping away decades of dust, and trying to impose some order on the forgotten dwelling. He cleaned the windows, letting in weak shafts of sunlight that only seemed to highlight the cabin's deep-seated gloom. It started subtly. A creak from the floorboards above when he was certain he was alone downstairs. He attributed it to the house settling, to the wind playing tricks, to his own overactive imagination in such an isolated place. He was determined not to let the solitude get to him. One afternoon, while he was trying to pry open a stubbornly stuck kitchen drawer, he heard a distinct scratching sound coming from the wall behind the stove. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like tiny claws skittering across wood. He froze, his hand on the drawer handle. A mouse, he told himself. An old house in the woods, it was bound to have rodents. He rapped sharply on the wall, and the sound ceased immediately. He waited, listening, but heard nothing more. He pulled the drawer open with a grunt, dismissing the incident. It was a fleeting, indistinct shape, gone before he could properly register it. He snapped his head up, scanning the room. Nothing. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the exhaustion of his journey and the constant low hum of apprehension that had begun to settle in his gut. He rose to stoke the fire, and as he turned back, he noticed a small, tarnished silver locket lying on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. He hadn't put it there. He was certain. He'd wiped the mantel clean that morning, placing nothing on it but a single, unlit candle. He picked it up, the metal cool beneath his fingers. It was old, intricately carved with a strange, almost unsettling symbol, a coiled serpent eating its own tail, and felt surprisingly heavy. He tried to open it, but the clasp was jammed. He frowned, a sliver of unease finally piercing through his determined rationality. He must have overlooked it, or perhaps it had fallen from a shelf above. He told himself it was just another quirk of the ancient cabin, another thing to fix or discard. He went to bed that night feeling a prickle of unease that the logical explanations couldn't quite soothe. The locket lay on the bedside table, its cold metal a small, solid presence in the oppressive darkness. He closed his eyes, straining to decipher the faint sounds of the house, of the forest, wondering if the silence was truly empty or merely holding its breath. It wasn't the will itself that coiled dread in his gut, but the single, stark photograph tucked behind it, a sepia-toned image of the cabin, stark and ancient, framed by a forest so dense it seemed to swallow the light. It was a distortion, a ripple in the fabric of the image itself, mirroring the strange twisting of reality he'd begun to experience. The memory of the cabin, specifically the last night he'd spent there, clawed at him. He'd tried to dismiss the flickering lights, the way the floorboards groaned under an unseen weight, the sudden, inexplicable chill that would seep into the room, raising gooseflesh despite the roaring fire. He'd even convinced himself the faint, earthy smell, like overturned soil mixed with something metallic, was just the old structure settling, or the dampness of the surrounding woods. But then the glass of water had slid, inch by agonizing inch, across the bedside table, stopping just before the edge as if held by an invisible hand. He hadn't touched it, hadn't dared. He'd simply stared, the rational part of his mind screaming for an explanation, while a deeper, primal part knew there was none. He couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't just a place he owned, it was a place that was beginning to own him. He pushed the will aside, his work forgotten. The meticulous data analysis on his screen, the endless rows of figures, seemed utterly trivial compared to the looming question of what, exactly, he had inherited. He found himself drawn to the station's archives, a sprawling digital repository usually reserved for scientific papers and historical geological surveys. The vastness of the digital library felt both overwhelming and strangely comforting, a sea of information where answers, however obscure, might lie. He started with the basics, typing his distant relative's name into the search bar. The initial results were sparse, an obituary, a few community mentions, nothing substantial. Then he broadened his search to the cabin's address, the specific tract of forest, even the regional municipality. The hum of the servers was a constant, almost hypnotic drone, a counterpoint to the frantic clicking of his keyboard. He dismissed it as imagination, the lingering scent of his own clothes, but the prickle on his neck persisted. His searches began to yield fragments. Old land deeds, some dating back centuries, mentioned the property not by street number, but by a sprawling description of boundaries, often referencing ancient markers, a gnarled oak, a particular stone outcrop. He found sporadic newspaper clippings from local historical societies, digitized and grainy. Most were innocuous, detailing property transfers or minor disputes. The article, yellowed and faded even on screen, detailed the vanishing of a small farming family. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty homestead. He dug deeper, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. Another article, from 1923, recounted a local logger who swore the trees themselves moved, that the forest rearranged itself, refusing to yield its timber. The logger, the article concluded, was later found wandering the main road, delirious, muttering about the hunger of the earth. A shiver traced its way down Reid's spine. This wasn't just local folklore, these were documented reports, albeit antiquated. The reports dismissed them as unremarkable localized variations, but the repeated mentions, sometimes underlined in the original handwritten notes now digitized, suggested otherwise. Then, he stumbled upon a scan page from a forgotten county history book, tucked away in an obscure section on local superstitions. It was a brief, almost dismissive paragraph about the indigenous people who had once inhabited the land. It spoke of a place where the veil between worlds thinned, a specific clearing, marked by the blood of the earth. The text didn't elaborate, but a small, hand-drawn symbol was sketched next to the passage, a spiraling knot, reminiscent of the distorted smudge on the cabin photograph. Reid leaned back from the screen, the fluorescent light glinting off his glasses. The hum of the servers, once a distant drone, now seemed to pulse, a living thing in the vast space. The metallic, earthy scent was stronger, undeniable. The phenomena weren't just in the cabin, they were reaching for him, even here. He was no longer just an inheritor, he was becoming entangled. The cabin wasn't merely built on an ancient burial ground, as rumor had it. It was built on something far older, far more demanding, and it was beginning to stir. Unremarkable localities. The phrase had been cut off, the page torn, leaving Reid with a gnawing frustration. He couldn't shake the feeling that the missing words held the key, a crucial piece of the puzzle deliberately excised. The cabin felt colder, the silence deeper, as if the very air around him listened, waiting for his next move. His initial unease had solidified into a grim determination. He wasn't just dealing with old timber and settling foundations, something ancient stirred beneath the floorboards, and those magnetic anomalies hinted at its physical tether to the earth. He remembered a faded reference in one of the more obscure historical society pamphlets, a regional geological survey office that had once operated out of an old research station further north, near the edge of the protected forest. It was a long shot, but the partial report had mentioned a specific survey number. If anyone had the complete documentation, it would be there, assuming it still existed. The drive was desolate, the paved road quickly giving way to gravel, then to a barely maintained dirt track that wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees pressed in, their branches skeletal against the overcast sky, their shadows long and grasping. He passed no other vehicles, no signs of human habitation. When the track finally opened into a small, overgrown clearing, the research station stood before him. It was a squat, single-story building of weathered concrete and corrugated iron, its windows grimy and opaque. A faded sign, half obscured by moss, proclaimed its former purpose. The place looked abandoned, a relic of a bygone era. Rows of metal filing cabinets, their paint peeling, lined the walls. Stacks of yellowed boxes teetered precariously on shelves, some spilling their contents onto the grimy floor. It was a man, elderly, with a shock of white hair and thick spectacles perched on his nose, poring over a ledger. He didn't look up immediately, lost in his task. "Excuse me?" Reid's voice felt unnaturally loud in the stillness. The archivist startled, his head snapping up. His eyes, magnified by the lenses, were watery and suspicious. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Reid explained about the geological survey, the magnetic anomalies, the incomplete report. The archivist listened, his expression unreadable, then slowly, deliberately, pointed a gnarled finger towards a particularly dusty section of cabinets. "Old records. Back there. Don't expect much." Most of that was filed and forgotten. Hours passed. Reid sifted through box after box, his fingers growing grimy, his throat parched from the dust. He found reports on mineral deposits, water tables, seismic activity, everything but what he needed. He was about to give up when, tucked away in a drawer beneath a stack of irrelevant meteorological data, he found it, a slim, leather-bound journal, its cover unmarked, its pages brittle with age. It wasn't a survey report, but something far more personal. The script inside was tight, meticulous, written in faded brown ink. It was a series of entries, dated nearly 2 centuries ago, penned by a distant ancestor, a man named Elias. Reid's breath hitched. Elias, the very relative whose sudden death had bequeathed him the cabin. The journal began innocuously enough, detailing daily life, crop failures, the harshness of the land. But then the tone shifted. Elias wrote of a blight, a sickness that ravaged their community, claiming children, livestock. Desperation etched itself into every line. Reid's eyes scanned the pages, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. Elias described a ritual, a pact made not with a benevolent spirit, but with something primal, something rooted deep within the earth itself. The pact required a lineage, a family line, to be forever bound to the land, to feed it, to acknowledge its dominion. "We thought we appeased it, that we bought our peace," Elias had scrawled, the ink bleeding slightly as if pressed with trembling hands. "But it does not sleep. It merely waits. It demands its due. One of us, always, to tend the tether. To be the anchor." The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, or at least inextricably tied to it. The cabin was merely its anchor, its physical manifestation, and his family, his lineage, were the unwilling caretakers, bound by a horrific, forgotten pact. The magnetic anomalies weren't just geological quirks, they were the pulse of something ancient, something demanding. He was not just an inheritor of a cabin, he was the next in line, a sacrifice unknowingly offered. The metallic tang in the air of the research station suddenly felt sickeningly familiar. It was the scent of old iron, of earth, of a promise made in desperation and paid in blood, echoing through generations. The flickering fluorescent lights of the research station hummed a sickly counterpoint to the thrumming in Reid's own skull. He had spent the last 2 days poring over brittle maps, ancient property deeds, and local historical records, the scent of dust and aged paper clinging to his clothes. The lead archivist, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had granted him access to the archives after a lengthy explanation about his family's unique historical connection to the region. He'd omitted the part about the malevolent entity. Reid's determination was a brittle shield against the gnawing fear that had begun to hollow him out. He sat hunched over a heavy oak table, a magnifying glass clutched in his hand, tracing lines on a hand-drawn survey map from the late 1700s. The cabin, marked with a small, faded ink square, sat precisely where he knew it to be, but around it, the surveyor had sketched curious symbols, not typical cartographic markers, but something more akin to a ward or an ancient sigil, repeating in a jagged perimeter. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the cool glass. The symbols pulsed faintly, or perhaps it was just the strain on his eyes. A sudden, sharp crack, like a dry branch snapping underfoot, echoed from the far end of the deserted archive. Reid froze, his head snapping up. The archivist had left an hour ago, locking the main doors. He was alone. It was the smell of the cabin, the smell of the forest floor after a particularly heavy rain, but here, indoors, it was an impossible intrusion. A chill, far deeper than the air conditioning, seeped into his bones, a cold that felt sentient, seeking. Reid gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white. He told himself it was old wiring, a power surge. But the thumps weren't random, they had a rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence that started distant and grew steadily closer. Thump. 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 His gaze darted around the cavernous room, past shelves stacked with forgotten histories, past the silent, shrouded microfilm readers. Nothing. The symbols on the map beneath his hand seemed to writhe, the ink deepening to a vibrant, disturbing black. Then, he saw it. Not with his eyes, not entirely. In the periphery of his vision, where the wall met the ceiling, the wallpaper began to ripple. Like water disturbed by a stone, but it wasn't water. It was the pattern itself, twisting, elongating, forming grotesque faces that stretched and contorted in silent agony. He blinked, hard, and the wallpaper was just wallpaper again, faded floral motifs. But the feeling of those faces lingered, an imprint on his mind. It wasn't a language he recognized, but the intent was clear, mine. Reid pushed away from the table, overturning his chair with a clatter that sounded deafening in the suddenly silent room. The thumping had stopped. The smell intensified, a sickening blend of decay and something metallic. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching for the heavy wooden door leading to the main hall, desperate to escape, to breathe air that wasn't tainted. The shelves of books shuddered, a few toppling to the floor with dull thuds. In that crimson gloom, the old map on the table flared with a sickly green luminescence. The intricate symbols on it, the ones that marked the perimeter around the cabin, pulsed with a malevolent energy. Reid's gaze was drawn to them, unable to tear away. And then, as if drawn by an unseen hand, a folded, much older parchment beneath the map shifted, revealing a single, archaic word etched onto its yellowed surface, sacrifice. The blood drained from Reid's face. He knew that word. He'd heard it whispered in the rustling leaves of the forest, felt its weight in the cold stone of the cabin's hearth. This wasn't just a pact, it was a ritual, a recurring horror tied to his very bloodline. The cabin wasn't just an anchor, it was an altar. And his family, not just caretakers, but offerings. He scrambled for the parchment, his fingers trembling as he unfolded it. It was a faded, handwritten ledger, filled with names and dates, spanning centuries. And beneath that, scrawled in what looked like the same ink, an unfinished entry. His own name. Reid. The entity wasn't just reaching for him, it was claiming him, marking him. He wasn't safe anywhere, not even in the sterile, supposedly secure confines of the research station. The cabin wasn't merely a place, it was a hungry maw, and he was already halfway down its throat. The land, the entity, his lineage, it was all a trap, carefully laid, and he was the next sacrifice. He was bound, irrevocably, to the ancient horror he had inherited. The word, heavy and cold as a tombstone, echoed in Reid's mind, ritual. It wasn't just a pact, a whispered agreement in the dark, it was a recurring horror, an intricate, terrible pattern woven into the very fabric of his bloodline. The cabin wasn't merely an anchor for something ancient, it was the heart of a malevolent machine, and he, Reid, was the latest gear in its grinding mechanism. He couldn't stay. Not anymore. Not if he wanted to keep the fragile threads of his sanity from unraveling completely. He would leave. He would find help. He would tear himself free from this lineage of sacrifice, no matter the cost. He moved with a frantic energy, stuffing his small backpack with a few essentials, a water bottle, a package of crackers, his phone, a worn map of the surrounding forest he'd found tucked into a drawer. He hesitated, then strapped it to the side of his pack. A futile gesture, perhaps, against something so pervasive, but it offered a sliver of comfort, a tangible defiance. He shoved the door open, the wood scraping against the warped frame with a shriek that felt torn from his own throat. He plunged into the familiar path he'd trodden countless times since his arrival, the one leading back to the gravel road, to what he hoped was civilization. But the forest immediately felt wrong. The trees were denser, closer, their branches interwoven like skeletal fingers. The path, once a clear indentation in the fallen leaves, seemed to ripple and shift beneath his gaze, fading into the undergrowth, then reappearing just out of reach. Panic began to prickle at his skin. He pushed forward, forcing his legs to move, his breath ragged in the cool air. He tried to orient himself, searching for the distinctive twin oaks that marked the halfway point to the road. They weren't there. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling with the slick plastic. No signal. Just a blank screen, a dead rectangle of technology in the face of ancient malevolence. Reid snatched the phone away from his ear, his heart hammering against his ribs. Driven by a desperate need for any sign of human presence, he veered off the fading path, remembering a faint rumor of an old, abandoned research station deep in this section of the woods. It was a long shot, a relic from a forgotten governmental survey, but it was a concrete structure, a potential radio, a chance. He pushed through thorny brambles that tore at his clothes and skin, the small wounds stinging. The research station. It was less a building and more a ruin, swallowed by the encroaching foliage. A single-story, corrugated metal structure, its windows boarded over, its paint peeling in vast, leprous flakes. He switched on the flashlight app on his phone, its weak beam cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the light, thick as snow. The interior was a chaos of overturned desks, shattered equipment, and mildewed papers. The place felt picked over, not by looters, but by something far more deliberate, far more patient. His light swept across a bulletin board, still clinging to a cracked plaster wall. Yellow documents, brittle with age, were pinned haphazardly. Most were indecipherable, scientific jargon, but one caught his eye. A faded diagram, hand-drawn, depicting a complex array of lines converging on a central point. Below it, scrawled in faded ink, a single word, repeated several times: containment. His eye snagged on the last one. A name he knew. His distant relative, the one who had owned the cabin. The one who had died so suddenly. The blood drained from Reid's face. This wasn't just a research station, it was a failed attempt to control something. Something they had known about. Something they had tried to contain. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was here too, had been here, had perhaps broken free from here. A low creak echoed from deeper within the station, a sound like stressed metal. Reid froze, every muscle tensed. The air grew impossibly heavy, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He scrambled backward, tripping over a fallen chair, a harsh clang echoing like a gunshot. He didn't know which way was out anymore. The trees seemed to have closed ranks behind him, the path he had followed now completely vanished. Every direction looked the same, an impenetrable wall of green. He ran, blindly, stumbling over roots and rocks, the axe bouncing against his back. The forest seemed to narrow around him, funneling him, guiding him. He heard phantom rustlings just beyond his peripheral vision, caught glimpses of fleeting, indistinct shapes between the trees. His breath tore at his throat, a raw, burning sensation. He was no longer trying to escape, he was being herded. He had circled back. The forest had played him a cruel, elaborate joke. Exhaustion, both physical and mental, slammed into him. He stumbled up the porch steps, the wood groaning under his weight, and collapsed against the door. He was back. Back in the heart of the horror. His efforts had been pointless, his escape a delusion. He was trapped. Utterly, irrevocably trapped. He needed to understand the design of the trap, the purpose of the crucible, before he became its final ingredient. The cabin offered no more answers, only increasingly aggressive manifestations. Its walls felt like skin, its floorboards like bones. Reid remembered a hushed conversation, a detailed gleaned from a forgotten letter found in a dusty trunk. His distant relative, the one who'd owned the cabin, had been something of an amateur historian, an obsessive collector of family lore. They'd even mentioned a small, private research station not far from the cabin, a place where they'd sequestered their more esoteric findings. The trees loomed, their branches like skeletal fingers. Reid's breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a visible testament to his escalating anxiety. He pushed through the undergrowth, his boots sinking into soft soil, following a barely discernible trail that seemed to twist and fade like a bad memory. The research station. It looked less like a place of scholarly pursuit and more like an abandoned shipping container that had been swallowed and regurgitated by the forest. A single, rusted padlock hung from a hasp on the heavy metal door, its chain thick with corrosion. Reid, with a surge of desperate energy, forced it open with a pry bar he'd brought from the cabin. The interior was a single, large room, lined with shelves overflowing with binders, yellow documents, and archaic recording equipment. A large, sturdy desk dominated the center, covered in stacks of handwritten notes. Reid moved with a frantic urgency, his eyes scanning, his hands sifting through the detritus of a lifetime's obsession. He found diaries, meticulously dated, filled with increasingly erratic script. He settled on a large, leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with age. The text was in his relative's neat, academic hand, but the content quickly dissolved into a terrifying narrative. The entries detailed a presence on the land long before the cabin, a primal hunger embedded in the very earth, predating all memory. Reid's fingers trembled as he read, the words blurring, then sharpening into stark, horrific clarity. His ancestors, in their desperate attempt to cultivate the land, had unwittingly disturbed this entity. They hadn't made a pact out of malice, but out of fear and a misguided attempt at control. They believed they could appease it, direct its hunger. Instead, they had merely tethered it to their bloodline, offering a sacrifice not of livestock, but of life itself. The entity's true nature, he learned, was a generational parasite. It didn't want random lives, it craved the essence of the family line that had awakened it. The ritual was not a single event, but a cyclical harvesting. Every few generations, a direct descendant, often the firstborn, or the one whose life force resonated most strongly with its awakening, was chosen. The entity fed on the potential of the bloodline, ensuring its own longevity by periodically pruning the family tree. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature made Reid gasp. A low hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, resonating in his bones. He heard a faint scratching, like claws on metal, coming from the far end of the room, then a slithering sound that seemed to pass just behind him. It will never be appeased. It only demands. And the cycle turns. The last offering was my brother. Now. It is my time. I have failed to break the chain. The next. It will be Reid. The firstborn. The most potent offering. The ledger slipped from Reid's numb fingers, clattering to the dusty floor. He wasn't just investigating a family curse, he was the next sacrifice. The entity's demands were absolute, and its ancient origins meant it had waited patiently, generation after generation, for its due. The buzzing intensified, a pressure building in his skull, a sensation of immense, invisible weight pressing down. He felt its hunger then, not as an idea, but as a palpable, terrifying emptiness that sought to consume him wholly. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent he now recognized as ozone mixed with the cloying sweetness of decay. He was not merely a descendant, he was the designated offering, the final, crucial component in a terrible, timeless ritual. The ledger, with its chilling final entry, still lay face down on the cabin's dusty floorboards. Reid hadn't bothered to pick it up. Its truths had burrowed into his bones, cold and absolute. The entity's demands were absolute, and its ancient origins meant it had waited patiently, generation after generation, for him. The research station wasn't what he'd imagined. Not a sterile, modern complex, but a cluster of ramshackle, weather-beaten buildings huddled together in a clearing, like forgotten bones. A single, larger structure dominated the clearing, its concrete walls stained with what looked like generations of mildew and grit, a heavy steel door, half ajar, like a silent invitation. The cold air bit at his exposed skin, a premonition more than a temperature. He clutched the heavy, leather-bound book he'd brought from the cabin, not the ledger, but a much older text he'd found hidden beneath the floorboards, filled with archaic script and unsettling diagrams. It was his only weapon, his only hope. The air inside was still and heavy, tasting of dust, decay, and something acrid, like burnt offerings. His breath plumed in the frigid space. Fluorescent lights, long dead, hung like broken limbs from the ceiling. The architecture was utilitarian, stark, but as he ventured further, he noticed something unsettling: symbols, etched into the concrete walls, repeating patterns that mirrored those in the ancient book he carried. They weren't random graffiti, they were deliberate, ritualistic. The hum intensified, a deep resonance that vibrated in his teeth, making his vision waver at the edges. He found the central chamber, a large, circular room with a massive, pitted stone slab dominating its center. This was it. The altar. The place where the pact had been forged. The air here was thick, pressing against his lungs, making it hard to draw a full breath. The symbols carved into the stone slab were identical to the ones in his book, a language of binding and sacrifice. It stretched, elongated, then coalesced into a towering, indistinct form. It wasn't a human shape, not exactly, but a twisting, columnar presence that pulsed with an internal, suffocating pressure. The metallic tang in the air sharpened, tasting like old blood. "You have come," a voice rasped, not with sound, but with a vibration that echoed directly in his skull, bypassing his ears entirely. It was ancient, vast, and utterly devoid of mercy. The final thread. He wouldn't be another name in a ledger. He raised the ancient book, its pages fluttering as if agitated by an unseen wind. He found the page, its script glowing faintly in his mind's eye, a counter-incantation, a severance. He began to read, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength, echoing against the concrete walls. The words were guttural, foreign, yet they felt right on his tongue, a forgotten language awakened. The hum became a deafening roar, the building groaning as if under immense strain. He felt a searing pain in his mind, a flood of horrific images. The station wasn't just an altar, it was a conduit, a feeding tube for something buried far beneath. The entity's roar intensified, a physical force that battered him, threatening to rip the book from his grasp. He staggered, but held firm. He knew what he had to do. The ritual demanded a personal sacrifice, a severance of the pact. He pulled a small, silver locket from beneath his shirt, a gift from his grandmother, a tangible link to his family, to the very bloodline the entity craved. He knew it was the only way to break the chain. With a desperate cry, he placed the locket on the stone slab, directly over the central, swirling symbol. "No!" the entity shrieked, a sound that ripped through the fabric of reality, shaking the very foundations of the research station. Reid pressed his hand onto the locket, forcing it down onto the cold stone, finishing the last, crucial line of the incantation, his voice raw, defiant. He could feel the entity's power surging, twisting, trying to overwhelm him, trying to reclaim its due. He was at the precipice, caught between annihilation and a desperate, impossible victory. The ancient book, heavy and cold in Reid's trembling hands, pulsed with an inner light that mirrored the frantic beat of his own heart. The script on the open page, once merely glowing, now flared, casting stark, dancing shadows across the cabin's warped walls. A guttural shriek tore through the air, not from his own throat, but from the very timbers of the house, a sound of agony and pure, unadulterated rage. Reid felt a searing pain erupt in his forehead, as if an invisible hand had clamped down, squeezing his skull. He wouldn't yield. He wouldn't become another forgotten name, another sacrifice. He focused on the glowing script, willing its power to manifest, to bind, to break. The entity, a formless presence that had warped his reality for weeks, recoiled. The cabin groaned, a living thing in torment. Dust rained from the ceiling, mingling with flakes of ancient plaster. He felt a profound drain, as if a siphon had plunged into his very core, pulling out his strength, his memories, his will. He staggered, but held fast to the book, its pages now fluttering violently, the light within them intensifying to an unbearable brilliance. The shriek reached a crescendo, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of the world, then abruptly, horrifyingly, it snapped. The light from the book imploded, leaving behind an afterimage burned onto Reid's retinas. Reid's legs buckled. When Reid next opened his eyes, the world was a blur of fluorescent light and muted colors. The scent of antiseptic stung his nostrils, a jarring contrast to the forest's damp earth and pine. He lay on a narrow cot, a thin blanket pulled up to his chest. His head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that resonated with the strange hum he now felt constantly, deep within his bones. He was not in the cabin. He pushed himself up, his muscles stiff and protesting. The room was sparse, functional. Steel cabinets lined one wall, a simple desk with a lamp on another. A single, small window showed a glimpse of a gray, overcast sky. He was in a small, isolated room within what he soon realized was a research station. How he got here, he couldn't recall. The last memory was the blinding light, the snapping shriek, and the collapse. A colleague, a man with kind, weary eyes, entered the room, carrying a tray with a glass of water and a piece of toast. "Reid," the colleague said softly, a genuine concern etched onto his face. "You're awake. You've been out for a while." Reid tried to speak, but his throat was dry, raw. "What happened?" The colleague hesitated, glancing at a monitor on his desk. "It's quiet now. The anomaly, whatever it was, it's gone. The structural integrity is stable. No more strange energy readings." He paused, then added, "You were found outside the perimeter, unconscious. It was quite a struggle to get you here." Reid took a long sip of water, the coolness a balm to his throat. He looked at his hands. The hum beneath his skin intensified, a low thrum that felt both alien and intimately a part of him. He closed his eyes, concentrating. He could feel it, a faint, ethereal tether stretching out, away from him, back towards the silent forest, towards the cabin. The entity wasn't gone. It was merely bound. And the binding was to him. The book hadn't banished the entity, it had transferred it. He remembered the searing pain in his forehead, the feeling of something being drawn out. The pact, the ancient lineage. It wasn't about containing a horror, but about channeling it. The research station felt like a cage now, not a sanctuary. He was no longer just a survivor, he was the new host, the living conduit. The hum intensified, a silent whisper in his mind, confirming his horrifying revelation. The entity was within him, dormant, perhaps, but waiting. It was a part of him now, an unholy inheritance. The cost of his survival wasn't just physical exhaustion or psychological trauma, it was the sacrifice of his very self, his autonomy, his future. The horror hadn't ended, it had merely taken root. And he was its new,
unwilling garden.
Reid took a long sip of water, the coolness a balm to his throat. He looked at his hands. He felt hollowed out, as if a vital organ had been surgically removed, leaving only an echo. The hum beneath his skin, however, was no longer a foreign invasion but a dull throb, a constant companion. It was the rhythm of a new heart, perhaps, one that beat with something ancient and cold. He moved through the cabin with a quiet finality, not packing, but observing. The air still carried the faint, cloying scent of decay and something metallic, a phantom odor he knew would cling to his memory long after he left. He ran a palm over the rough-hewn timber of the kitchen table, the wood cool and unyielding beneath his touch. He understood now. The cabin wasn't merely a place, it was a nexus, a monument to a terrible bargain. The entity hadn't been trapped in the cabin had been built to serve it, and by extension, his bloodline. Leaving was not an escape, he realized, but a re-engagement with a world that now seemed impossibly fragile. He walked out the front door without looking back, the dry crunch of pine needles beneath his boots unnaturally loud. He started the truck, the engine's roar a jarring intrusion into the sylvan quiet. He drove, the winding dirt road spooling out behind him, each turn a severance from the place that had nearly claimed his sanity. The world outside the forest felt muted, a watercolor painting against the stark, high-contrast reality he now carried within him. Buildings seemed flatter, colors less vibrant, human voices a distant murmur he struggled to fully process. He drove for hours, the destination less important than the act of putting distance between himself and the cabin. Eventually, the need for solid ground, for a place that promised a kind of sterile objectivity, led him to a sprawling, utilitarian research station nestled in a valley far from any major town. It was a place for observation, for study, for cataloging the world's oddities, or so its brochure had promised. He found a quiet corner in their public archive, a room filled with microfiche readers and dusty tomes on local history and folklore. He wasn't looking for answers anymore, he had found them, etched into the very fabric of his being. He was looking for confirmation, for a framework to understand the impossible truth. He located a brittle, leather-bound volume detailing local land grants and historical anomalies. Flipping through the yellowed pages, his finger traced a familiar surname. His own. They weren't protective wards, he now knew, but sigils of ownership, of fealty. Generations of his family had been the keepers, the feeders, the ones who ensured the balance remained undisturbed through ritual sacrifice. Not just animal, but human, chosen from those who strayed too close, or those who were simply forgotten. The entity, the malevolent presence, wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming its due, claiming him star. He was the last in a line of tenders, and the pact had simply come knocking again. Reid looked up. He could smell it then, faint but unmistakable, the metallic tang of old blood, the sweet rot of forgotten things. It was the cabin's breath, following him, a silent declaration that he was still bound. He glanced around. No one else seemed to notice. A young researcher across the room continued to type, oblivious. The research station offered no shield, no sanctuary from the truth he carried. He closed the book, the leather creaking softly. The tremor in his hands had returned, but beneath it, the hum was stronger, a deeper resonance. He wasn't just Reid anymore. He was a keeper, a descendant of a lineage bound by an ancient, terrible promise. The entity hadn't consumed him, not entirely, but it had carved out a space within him, an echoing chamber where its presence would forever reside. The world was still there, vibrant and oblivious, but for Reid, it was now merely a stage, and he, a player in a drama whose final act was yet to unfold.